Hi. Thank you for staying this late. So we start panel number 4, the changing narrative about work business. My name is Ranjoo Herr. I'm in philosophy department, and my co-track chair is Jill Brown from management. And so the first presentation is by Jill, and her title is Employees as Conduits for Effective Stakeholder Engagement, an example from B corporations.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to go as fast as I can, but I have one big slide that tells you about some current research I'm doing. Very broadly asking the research question, is there a link between how a firm manages their internal and external stakeholders? Or, more specifically, are firms that are giving employee stock ownership and also giving their employees more say in running the firm more likely than to engage with external stakeholders in a good way? And when we say external stakeholders, we're talking about suppliers, the community, and maybe representatives from the broader environment. And the way we test for this, or try to answer this research question, is in the context of B corporations. Now, I say we, I should point out that this is a paper that I've written with some friends and colleagues at Baruch University. Anne Laura Winkler, she's a young assistant professor there, and David Feingold, who's a very established scholar in the HR arena in management. So we look at the context of B corporations, and for anybody that doesn't know what a B corporation is a corporation that gets some tax benefits from being a B corporation. And as part of their establishment as a B corporation, they have to make CSR a part of their core responsibilities. They may attest and report that they meet minimum standards for social performance based on a rigorous assessment that's certified by the nonprofit B Lab. 30 states have passed benefit corporation legislation that allows them to get some tax benefits, but companies also need to elect benefit corporation status. So given that stakeholder engagement, this concept of stakeholder engagement, requires the type of interaction between their stakeholders that is both strategic and that's morally grounded. That's kind of the language that goes with stakeholder engagement. And it requires an honest flow of information between and among stakeholders. This B corporation sample is a good context to try to assess and test for stakeholder engagement overall. Now, what I should tell you is the sample actually breaks out because you can be a benefit corporation, a B corporation, or you could be a super-de-duper benefit corporation, which means you get certification status. You get a super stamp because you get certified based on a high standard of environmental and social metrics. These are companies that are private, they're small and medium-sized, and again, this offers a good kind of breeding ground for some of these stakeholder engagement measures. Long and short is we test a sample of 347 firms, firmly balanced between certified and non-certified, and we find that employee ownership is positively associated with external stakeholder engagement. Employee involvement is positively associated with stakeholder engagement. The interaction of the two, not so much. We don't find findings there, but there's a lot of convoluted construct between EI and EO. But we see that when they get certification, it actually positively moderates this relationship. So the long and short of this is, it's great if you can engage well with your employees through stock ownership and involvement, and it suits you even better in your ability as a firm to engage with your external stakeholders. And if you then force the arm or twist the arm of the firms to get certified and be pro-CSR, then they're even better at stakeholder engagement, both internally and externally. That's what I got.
Thank you, Jill. So the next presentation is by Wiley, Davi from English and Media Studies, and Duncan Spelman from Management. The title is Leading with Uncommon Sense. And we have a video presentation.
And we hope this works. And if it doesn't, I have backup.
Many of you have had the experience of killing time in an airport bookstore. As you peruse the offerings, you see 12 or 27 or 46 books on how to become a more effective leader. Leaders Eat Last, Leadership 101, H3 Leadership, The Power of Positive Leadership, and on and on and on. You retreat to the safety of the food court. Yet here we are, your Bentley colleagues, writing another book on leadership, Leading with Uncommon Sense.
We contend that common sense approaches to leadership very often do not produce the results that leaders seek, nor do they reduce the number of sleepless nights. By common sense approaches, we mean relying on popular wisdom about how leaders need to behave, and maybe even using some of the techniques that are taught in the programs like those in which we teach. We suggest relying more on uncommon sense, slowing down, engaging with rather than suppressing emotions, paying attention to racial and other differences, and embracing uncertainty. This chart highlights some of the key differences between leading with common sense and leading with uncommon sense.
Leading with uncommon sense involves 3 steps: pause, introspect, and react. At the core of the approach is the need to slow down, to pause. Leaders are often expected to produce answers to challenging questions immediately. Any brief moment of hesitation is often read as a sign of weakness. We argue that pausing, rather than a sign of weakness, provides access to insight. We advocate pausing both in the moment, when the situation demands a bit of extra time to think, as well as later on in order to reflect on what occurred. By pressing pause, we give ourselves the time to introspect. Introspect is not a very commonly used word. It refers to the process of examining one's own thoughts or feelings. Interestingly, there are very few words in our everyday vocabulary that capture this activity. During the introspect step, 4 reminders can help leaders focus attention on key aspects of their cognitive processes that are often out of awareness.
The reminder to be humble highlights that much of our thinking goes on outside of our conscious control, and therefore our behavior is often influenced by processes of which we are not aware. Unconscious thinking has a significant say in what we decide to eat for lunch, who our friends are, and decisions leaders make on promotions, strategic initiatives, and organizational restructuring. We encourage leaders to hold their positions lightly, rather than attempting to always be the strong and decisive leader that common sense calls for. The reminder to be emotional helps leaders embrace a somewhat unconventional understanding of the place of emotions in leadership. For centuries, emotions have frequently been seen as dangerous and even animalistic, but emotions can provide crucial information if leaders are able to access their feelings and make sense of what they are saying. Many, if not most, leaders are encouraged to be colorblind as they deal with the complex realities of racial differences, to treat everyone the same. Our reminder, "Don't be colorblind," says the opposite. Of course, the intention behind the instruction to not see color is admirable, but the unintended consequences of this approach are usually very negative. And this reminder extends well beyond race. Our advice is don't be gender blind, don't be age blind, don't be sexual orientation blind, etc. The reminder to be uncertain emphasizes the importance during the introspect step of watching for the brain's sometimes dangerous drive towards certainty. This characteristic of the brain's functioning can cause leaders to oversimplify, to avoid complexity, to reach closure prematurely. As recommended in connection with the Be Humble reminder, we encourage leaders to hold their positions lightly, to be uncertain.
Pausing to introspect makes everything much messier for leaders, and yet they must take action. They cannot allow themselves to be paralyzed by the constellation of forces they face. The 3rd step in the practice of leading with uncommon sense, react, involves leaders taking what they have learned through the pause and introspect steps to reframe their choices about how to behave. We have used the react formulation rather than just act to highlight a second aspect of this step. Not only must leaders act, but also they frequently can circle back and act again, or react. In fact, an important element of leading with uncommon sense is the recognition that we often do have a second or third or fourth chance. That's 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. So our next presenter is Ranjoo S from the Philosophy Department.
Thank you. For the sake of time, I'm just going to read from my prepared paper here. So the current wave of economic globalization, which I call neoliberal globalization, has been touted as the engine for spreading prosperity around the world and lifting all boats. It originates from the Bretton Woods system established after the Second World War, which founded the three Bretton Woods institutions of IMF, World Bank, and GATT, with the last of which was replaced by WTO in 1995. I consider here two notable consequences of neoliberal globalization to assess its impact on the global poor. First, the IMF and the World Bank have imposed on nation states obtaining loans from them neoliberal structural adjustment policies such as dismantling state enterprises, reducing real wages, cutting government price subsidies, liberalizing financial markets. Although the official rationale for the international economic institutions' loans to third world nation states was to help them develop, many loaning nation states have experienced an increase of their debt without the benefit of development. In fact, the debt crises of the third world reached a point by 1983 at which the money flow from the third world to the global north in the form of debt payment has exceeded the money flow from the global north to the third world in the form of loans and aid. The impact of structural adjustment policies has been devastating to women, children, and the poor in the affected nation states. Since 1995, WTO has adjudicated trade conflicts in favor of reducing tariff barriers or eliminating any perceived barrier to trade and investment. Often, government measures to protect the health of citizens and the environment were pitted against the interests of transnational corporations to make profit by flooding the foreign market with their cheap products, with dubious impact on human health and the environment. But WTO has almost always been on the side of transnational corporations. More disturbingly, these decisions have been made behind closed doors, safe from public scrutiny. Second, the liberalization of financial transactions that allows short-term investments of financial assets, such as stocks, bonds, derivatives, imposed on third world nation states, has led to extreme economic volatility and instability. As the 1997 Asian financial crisis exemplifies, its impact has often been devastating for ordinary citizens of such nation states. Regarding the liberalization of trade, pro-globalizers have touted the increased global GDP as evidence for its positive influence, claiming that the increased global wealth will trickle downwards and benefit the rest of the humanity. The reality is that neoliberal economic policies that drive neoliberal globalization have favored the extremely wealthy. The gap between rich and poor nation states, with a small number of exceptions such as China and India, as well as the gap between the rich and the poor within nation states, have dramatically widened. The result is that the richest 1% of the world has more wealth than the rest of the world combined as of 2016. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Marianne Delpo. Am I saying this right? Kulow? Kulow. There you go. And I guess this is a paper with Scott Thomas as well?
Yes.
And of course, Marianne's in the Law and Taxation and Financial Planning Department.
Thank you. So I'll try to wake you up a little bit by speaking as quickly as I can. This is a overview by necessity of the timing of really two projects that Scott and I are working on together. We thought about having Scott come up here, but we knew we'd never keep it to 4 minutes. This is about technology, but I just want to clarify that neither of us are tech people. I had the opportunity to hear some people who do know about technology a whole lot more than either Scott or I, and is humbling. We are looking at this from a legal and tax perspective. My background is in employment law, and Scott's is primarily in tax law. So we took a look at two types of technology in the workplace, and so it's really two types of technology, two issues, two papers, one of which is pretty much done and the other is not, so I'll say a little bit about each. The first is technology we looked at is assistive technology, which has really just mushroomed in the last 5 years or so, and has proven to be incredibly helpful to disabled workers. By this, I'm talking about things like touch screens, smart hearing aids, improved closed captioning, mobility devices, you name it. Some of these things, those of us who consider ourselves able-bodied and able-minded use as well, but they were developed in large part for folks who have some form of disability. Because they've been marketed so broadly, there is a growing variety of these. Their performance has improved, the price points have gone down, but they're still really underutilized by employers for their intended purpose, which is to help assist disabled workers be more fully integrated in the workplace. And in part, this is because employers have an outdated sense of the availability and effectiveness of these technologies, and also what their cost would be, both the purchase cost and the implementation costs. And so we looked at this from a perspective of, so let me give you the other technology, and then I'll tell you what we think might be done. The other type of technology we considered is automation technology, which replaces human workers. And this, this is also burgeoning at the moment. Things like ATMs, which we of course now take for granted, but which are now on our phones in some ways, as well as at the buttons at the side of the building, self-checkout, electronic toll booths, driverless cars, robots. All of these things are also becoming available at lower costs, and they're more effective. These are embraced by shareholders, right, because they are saving us all kinds of money, and they may increase efficiency, but they also result in a growing number of people losing jobs, right? So both of these types of technologies can be terrific enhancements of the workplace used properly, and we looked at how we might use legal regulation and tax incentives to maximize the positive and minimize the negative impacts of each of these. So our first proposal on the assistive technology side is to use some current already existing regulations that exist at the EESC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, to increase the use of assistive technology as a reasonable accommodation, which is required by federal law for employers to try to provide to disabled workers, and mainly to require employers to investigate and thoroughly report that they have considered the costs of purchasing or implementing an assistive technology before rejecting it, to ensure that they're just not rejecting it out of hand without really being properly fully informed, and coupling that with some enhanced tax incentives for hiring disabled workers. These already exist, but they're not very motivational right now. The second proposal is to look at imposing some kind of one-time tax on employers who are automating to offset the temporary unemployment and retraining costs, since the employers are reaping the biggest benefits and their shareholders from these automation technology. So the goals in a nutshell, basically in everyday language, to consider an Echo, which now costs $180 as a reasonable accommodation, something we should expect employers to be willing to provide for an employee who might need it to do their job, but at the same time retrain and reemploy the 400 Massachusetts Turnpike toll collectors when electronic tolling replaces toll booths, so that taxpayers benefit from this, but not at the expense of paying to support all those unemployed toll collectors. So that's it. Thank you.
So our next presentation is from Bob McNulty, Business for Peace in the New Narrative, and Bob is on site in Bogota, is that right? Yes. Yes, and so he's provided us a video, which again, I hope works. So I don't have backup for this. I'm really hoping. Whoops, 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 whoops.
I'm delighted to be here and to speak to you on the topic of Business for Peace. We're talking about the narrative of business, and we are narrative creatures. There's extensive research that shows that as a species, we are guided by narratives. We make sense of the world through stories, and we make decisions and plans based on the guidance of many narratives. And in this talk, I want to argue that business has operated for many decades and many generations under a misguided narrative. And I will propose that Business for Peace actually constitutes an alternative narrative that I believe offers a very valid and valuable perspective on how business can constructively contribute to society. Some narratives are so entrenched that they're accepted as facts of reality when in fact they may be totally wrong. And examples of this include racism and sexism and those who deny climate change. But I think another similarly important misguided narrative is the one that businesses really solely exist for profit maximization. And if this narrative were true, then the only really relevant difference between Apple computers and the mafia and the Red Cross would be their relative profitability. This narrative, unfortunately, has been taught and reinforced through many business schools. And it's something that is actually, I think, impoverished the whole understanding and practice of business. And I think that we in the business education field have an obligation to try to provide a richer and more robust alternative to this narrative. The introduction of the business ethics, particularly as it emerged in the 1970s, began to open up a much more subtle and meaningful and complex view of the purpose of business. And I think this view is particularly important because it shed light on the fact that among human institutions, businesses are unique in operating at every sector of society. Now, businesses, we know, are often associated with war and peace sometimes. But what is especially important about Business for Peace as a narrative is it follows from awareness that if we think creatively and constructively about what business can be, we can see how it can be leveraged to contribute to the stability, peace, and social flourishing. To an extent that people are aware of Business for Peace is generally associated with the positive role that business has in mediating conflicts in the developing world. And that's true. But Business for Peace is not only for developing countries or for hot conflicts. It applies to any society in which there are entrenched conflicts. And this includes even the most economically advanced societies. For example, in recent years, the world has seen the worst refugee crisis since the Second World War. And this has contributed to a rise in tension, particularly in Europe, between many Europeans and the newly arrived immigrants, virtually all of whom are initially unemployed. In response, Starbucks in Europe made a pledge last June and said they would hire 10,000 refugees over the next 5 years. Now, one company can only do so much, but Starbucks made a principled decision and showed what one company can do if they try to respond to a social problem such as the tension between refugees and their host countries. Now, unlike profit maximization narrative, the Business for Peace offers a very powerful and socially affirming narrative for business in every society. Yet, Business for Peace is certainly not very well understood. So one of the things that we need to do for this narrative to gain traction is to work hard at trying to build understanding, and we need to profess it, and we need to have it practiced, and then we need to see it spread globally. Thank you very much.
All right. Our next speaker, we have Marco Mirabelli, who's presenting a paper on perceived role relationships in human algorithm interactions, exploring the dynamics between Uber drivers and the Uber app. And this is a paper with Shinru Page.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. I didn't remember the title was so long, but actually the content is much easier to understand. So yes, this paper is with the Shinru and also with Monideepa, who I don't know, is not listed, but she's a professor at Lancaster University in the UK, and of course she cannot be here. So let me tell you something about the study. We decided to try and understand how emerging technologies such as algorithms can shape and modify work relationships. So we engaged in a study with Uber drivers, because Uber drivers on a daily basis deal with an algorithm that is the strange app that they have on the phone that says how many people they can pick up if they do carpooling, how much money they make, and then they find the ratings, and so basically they know how much money they have made that day. So it's a very complex app, and the algorithm is something that they sometimes fight, sometimes use to be more efficient, and so we found this new relationship between humans and computer very interesting. So we interviewed 15 Uber drivers. I know it's not many, this is a research in progress, but I have no idea how difficult it is to find Uber drivers available to be interviewed for a number of reasons, including the political implications of Uber as a company. So some people just don't want to be identified as Uber drivers. So we really had to work hard to identify these people, and we plan to identify another 15 Uber drivers US-wide in the next couple of months. Anyway, so these interviews were very interesting, and let me outline some of the main findings. First, we found that Uber drivers have different interpretations of the algorithm that they use. So some see the algorithm as their boss. So they have to do what the algorithm says. So pick up these people, do this route, but the algorithm may be wrong. So some people see the algorithm as a buddy, like somebody that can work with them. And some other people see the algorithm as a helper, so somebody that they can really exploit. And so depending on how people interpret the algorithm, of course, they have different dynamics. The other findings, and then I'll go back to what happens when an algorithm is a boss. So the other finding was that clearly human-computer interactions when algorithms are in play are totally different than traditionally human-computer interactions. So if we do a feeling and sentiment analysis when we use ERP systems or even laptops, we can be angry or happy if it works. With algorithms, the feelings are much more complex. We specifically found that when Uber drivers see algorithms are their boss, they develop two constructs that are role ambiguity and role conflict. So they think that they have multiple bosses. For example, the boss may be the algorithm, or the boss may be the customer, because the customer rates you, and depending on the rate, some people can drop your ride if they want. And so this is a very interesting dynamic. But more importantly, we found that it's very difficult for Uber drivers to work out the relationship with the algorithm as the boss, because they cannot interact with the boss. So in a normal work settings, you can question the boss, discuss, and maybe find a solution, but the algorithm doesn't make itself available to discuss. And so we found this dynamic extremely interesting, and we want to move forward and study it more in depth. Thank you.
Okay. So the next presentation is by Marc Stern in History, A Study in Change, the Ongoing Evolution of Work Since 1970.
Hi. Today I'll briefly highlight some developments in a few areas of recent studies of work. One interesting question is work as self-validating labor versus the increasingly degraded aspects of paid work in many fields. Productive and meaningful work is important to identity for most of us, but much of the work done in our society does not realize meaning. Rather, such work yields a disconnect between survival and meaning. Scholars such as James Livingston have challenged both right and left-wing analysts by advocating a consumption-oriented basic guaranteed income, first experimented with during the 1970s, that encourages enhanced compensation for paid work and voluntary work not valorized in our society, while discouraging an emphasis on poverty wage full employment as a cure for what ails us. Not surprisingly, technology is radically transforming work. From the 70s on, CAD/CAM and robotization changed manufacturing, sometimes enhancing efficiency and other times yielding failures, as at GM with its excessive rigidities. Meanwhile, digital reorganization continues to transform processes, organization, management, to automate routinized tasks and provide real-time monitoring and coordination of work. Some analysts argue that such automation is now responsible for 6 times the job loss as offshoring. Scholars like Livingston and futurists like Martin Ford expect this to accelerate over the next 20 years. Meanwhile, changes in social and economic structure have also encouraged transformation. U.S. population has increased by 60% since 1970, diversified ethnically, and the workforce has grown with the increase of women workers while shifting from agriculture, manufacturing, and transportation to finance in general and professional services. Stagflation in the 1970s brought corporate reorganization from the 1980s on, as mergers were matched by disaggregation or fissuring of organizations. The shift from pensions to investment funds featured prominently in what one author has called the end of loyalty. Work became less secure for millions as deindustrialization, relocation, globalization, outsourcing, and offshoring transformed worker-firm relationships. Lifetime work gave way to unpredictability for millions, including increased temp and part-time work from the 1990s onward, with no guarantees of permanent employment for many. Regulatory enforcement and safety inspection declined while wage theft increased. Financialization further undermined the worker-firm environment. By the 21st century, millions worked as gig, often platform-based subcontractors. This increased work flexibility and autonomy for some, but provided few of the benefits of bygone days, crucial to those dependent on this work, unless forced through worker organization. Fissured organizations employed millions performing tasks around the world. Lead firm employment shrank as subcontracting, franchising, and fractured supply chains replaced direct worker ties, and firms often became coordinating brands and development shops as much as producing and distributing entities. Both the gig and fissured economies continue to grow based on communication and control technologies. All facilitate returns to capital and away from workers. Unionization has also declined in the face of such deindustrialization, globalization, reorganization, workplace flight, outsourcing, offshoring, contingent work, fissured organization, employer resistance, and increased competition, union blunders, and decreased federal and state support. Actually, the poster portion of the paper offers a more extensive look at these questions. Thank you.
For our final presentation, we have Joe Weiss from the Management Department talking about ethical implications of the sharing economy, influences, and related firm practices.
Well, the only thing separating you from those drinks over there is me. So I'll try to be timely and to the point. Stakeholder management has not been really married or joined with issues management frameworks until relatively recently. But to do a stakeholder management study, one usually has to have an issue or some kind of topical subject to say what are we studying and who are we studying and why. In this particular paper, the topical subject is how ethical and socially responsible is and has Airbnb been as a social economy company. Let's just do a quick survey here. How many people have stayed in an Airbnb facility? How many people have, now be honest, make money from Airbnb? Okay, we don't have those stakeholders here with us. How many people are relatively satisfied with Airbnb services? Look around you. Okay, so that's part of the answer that we found too with this study, but let's talk about it. So stakeholder management has been around, as I said, for many years, but it's not just identifying the stakeholders that's a task, which it shows up here, but it's also finding out where they stand on a particular issue. What's their stake in it? Where do they stand? And that's where the issues management framework comes in. So in a study like this, it's important to do a timeline, which is also a major events timeline, which shows what Airbnb has done to whom over time and what's been the result, both of interactions, policies, and events. Then after that's done, we can begin to, this lower hand framework here, see who's the supportive stakeholders, who's the non-supportive stakeholders, who's the marginal stakeholders, and who's the stakeholders that really don't think they're going to move to being supportive stakeholders. And that's really, in a nutshell, what a stakeholder with an issues management framework produces. Now, what goes into that timeline are qualitative studies, quantitative studies, surveys, Delphi method. So this study is only as robust as the issues themselves are identified. And by the way, I've been doing this for many years. This is the book this is not a promotional, by the way. Take that off the tape.
No. Looks promotional to me. Sorry, just saying.
But 4 or 5 students have won the Hoffman Best Paper Prize for Best Graduate Paper in Ethics using these methodologies. And I'm going to be delivering one of those papers by a student, a graduate student, who couldn't be here today. So what? What did we find? Well, let me just hypothesize here a little bit because it's a work in progress. Airbnb is quite successful in terms of the venture capitalist stakeholders, and it seems to be pretty successful in terms of customers and host. Now, there are those who are disgruntled. There are some issues. There are some legislative actions being taken. But as we stand back and look at ethically, well, they're learning by doing. They have a productivist leadership style. This is Tony Buono's term from one of his papers. But they have this limitless expansionist business strategy along with the venture capitalist. That could be a problem. At the same time, they have this naive universalist ethic. That is, let's help people. Let's do what's best for the individual toward the host and guest and media. But they also have this reciprocity and calculated and accommodative ethic with government regulators in particular. And that is, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. So we don't know to what extent self-regulation is going to win out along with government regulation. It's a work in progress. Thank you.
All right, thank you. That was very good. And wow, you guys are great, right on time. Before we would have a slight change in the program, Marcia is going to be coming up on behalf of the Research Council in a minute, and then we'll get into our networking and poster session, and then that will ultimately phase into the pub night. But there's one more person I wanted to thank, and I delayed this because I wanted to make sure everything was going to work. I probably should have had more faith. Unfortunately, he's not here right now, but the individuals from his office who were videotaping this make sure that Steve watches this portion of the video, and that's Steve Salina. Steve is so good at what he does that I think we simply take him for granted. He was the one who helped us put all the videos together, and he videotapes these events, and he's an incredibly supportive colleague, and I really do think we owe him a vote of our support and gratitude for all that he does for us. So make sure Steve sees that. Okay, to wrap things up, on behalf of the Research Council, the chair of the council, Marcia Cornet.
Thank you, everybody that's still here. I just, on behalf of the Research Council, do want to give a great big thanks to Tony Buono for putting together, I think, the most organized research colloquium we have had in the last 5 years. You want to do it again next year? I also want to thank very much Susan Capolino-Cocuzzo. She's been great in organizing food, everything. I want to thank Bill Wiggins. I want to thank Viggy Lafarge, who gives us the money to do this. Heikki Topi, who's been instrumental in helping with Tony as well. I also want to thank George Gratton. He's here. He did the pamphlet. He's gotten all of the PR ready for us and everything. So thank you very much. It's been, like I said, one of the best we've had. They seem to get better every year. But this is my third year as Research Council Chairman, and it seems to, let me also say thank you, track chairs. How can I forget track chairs and presenters? This was excellent. Like I said, I think it's the best one we have had so far. But this has been my third year as the Research Council Chair, and it seems to me that every year, there's so many great presentations, but one always seems to stand out for me. For example, I remember 3 years ago at the Sustainability Colloquium, I still to this day remember that I need to find a tree under which my unprocessed body needs to be buried when I die. I don't know, if you weren't here, you missed it. Last year, I learned that I can actually carry a toilet in my purse. Again, if you weren't here, you missed it. And this year, what I learned is that when I was thinking about becoming a PhD, one of the things that convinced me to do it, not the main thing, but it was up there, was that I could find a job where I could wear blue jeans to work every day. And that was 35 years ago. And what I've learned today is that the business world has now caught up, and that I could maybe now, as I'm getting near retirement here, go back in the future of business and maybe start again in the business world and still get to wear my blue jeans. So it's good to see that the business world has caught up to academia at this point. And also when I retire and go back and wear my blue jeans, I won't have to worry about clopenings, I've learned today too. So for those of you that are still here, as Tony said, a little reward. We'll try and get the pub night going a little early and have the discussions from the last two groups over a beer or wine and some food. So again, thank you very, very much. Great success, and I look forward to seeing everybody next year. Thank you.